Howdy friends, my name's Milo Rossi, and while it may not look like it, today I'm in a cemetery. Milo, I thought you were supposed to be talking about your book. What are you doing in a cemetery? Well, see, this is not just any cemetery. Today I am on the outskirts of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts. For any of you who took an American history class, you are probably familiar with the significance of this place. Not only does it have a deep-rooted connection with the American Revolution, but it is also the birthplace of transcendentalism. This is a philosophy that I learned about for the first time probably when I was in high school. A way of thinking that champions the sacred relationship between man and nature, and how our daily perceived mundane tasks can be our own sacred rituals. It's a way of thinking that was pioneered by philosophers and writers like Louisa May Alcott, Henry David Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it's a way of thinking that I've always identified with and been inspired by. And that is why I find myself here today, because it is in these sacred grounds that those who are responsible for the birth of the transcendentalism movement are buried. I'm sure they would love the fact that there are fucking private jets flying overhead right now. Henry David Thoreau is rolling in his grave. And so it is here in the shade of the trees that will forever watch the great authors that came before me that I would like to share the first piece of literary work that I have ever put into the world. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Milo Rossi, and welcome to Chapter 1 of the Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful. As you're watching this video, I am currently in Peru. Well, not currently. You're watching the video while I am in Peru. Does this look like Peru to you? And when I'm back, my team and I are going to be full swing on launching Mini Minuteman Phase 3. If you haven't seen my teaser for Phase 3, you should check it out. I don't know why I pointed up like I'm going to remember to put a card in the video. I am not going to remember to put a card in the video. And so until Phase 3 launches, Jesus, it's noisy out here. Planes, cicadas. I really need a rocket launcher. But being on that YouTube grind, I know that I need to keep, my content up while I'm waiting for Phase 3 to launch. So without further ado, why don't we get into the Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful. This is my dedication for this book, for my mother's gift of words and my father's sense of purpose. So, thank you to both of you for making me who I am today. Introduction. We are all familiar with the phrase, history repeats itself, and while this is most frequently preceded by a sigh and a particularly dour outlook on the current political state, this saying is one that I believe has a much more profound meaning. We tend to view our history as linear, a long string of technological innovations and historical events that brought us to the world we share today. While I would agree that historical events and advancements are, for the most part, a linear progression, the story of humanity itself is completely different. Our story is not a linear event, but a wheel, an ever-turning cycle as the most incredible species to walk the face of the planet continues to reinvent the world around us despite our most primordial needs and frivolous desires remaining unchanged. You and I are the most recent entry in the book of humankind that has been written for far, far longer than many of us think. Our species, Homo sapiens, has functionally existed as we do today for the last 200,000 years. For the entire duration of this time, our world has been home to people who were exactly like you and I. People who walked upright and carried their children on their backs when the youngsters' little legs were too tired to press on. People who turned their faces towards the sky to laugh as they felt the first heavy drops of rain fall after a summer drought and splashed in the puddles when the deluge subsided. People who felt the flames of love, the elation of laughter, and the stings of loss. If you were to think of any point in history, your mind would likely jump to great events and the places where they occurred. Perhaps the Hittites would come to mind, who, sword in hand, ushered forth the beginning of the Iron Age. Perhaps your imagination would take you to the stabbing of Julius Caesar on the Senate floor, or to a blood-stained battlefield where the crack of rifle fire and the courageous commands of Major General Meade echo as he led his troops to a decisive victory at the Battle of Gettysburg. But have you ever wondered what it was like to be a mother during the Mesolithic period as the climate shifted and seas rose and wild game migrated? Or what types of dogs paced the wide streets and narrow forest paths of North America as their masters constructed some of the largest earthenworks in the world? Or what meals were eaten by starlight under the old-growth forests of ancient Europe? Or how China accidentally invented standardized testing by redefining their government? Or what fashion trends shook the mining camps during the California gold rush? With no one left from these times, it can be hard to look back upon the people of the past and think of them as more than just a faceless horde. But it is these average people who make history. With an estimated 120 billion people having lived, breathed, and died on this spinning celestial rock, it is no small wonder that the names that withstand the test of time are those who accomplished great feats, and not those who jumped in a puddle a little too hard and got soaked. Yet there is something about these simple stories that put a smile on our faces, something so timeless about a shared human experience that enchants the imagination more than an index of great events in the back of a dusty textbook. You can read about the speculated life of the great Viking Ragnar Lothbrok and surely be captivated by the stories of this legendary hero, yet no matter how great his achievements may be, there is something about the simple story of another Viking who once stood 10 feet above sea level and felt the need to carve into a rock, "I am very high up," that fascinates us in a much different but equally powerful way. While this Viking's name may be long lost to history, it is safe to say that his sense of humor is one that transcends nearly 1,000 years of human development. Despite the more mundane experiences frequently being left out of the history books, the evidence for it litters our world. While we cannot resurrect every tale of our history, there are countless that resonate as part of the cyclical human experience. For this reason, this book has been divided into chapters based around the stages of life. We will start at the beginning, a very good place to start, with the birth and childhood. As we make our way through the human story, we will learn about the meals we ate, love and sexuality, fashion statements, work and education, and finally, the great equalizer, death and the burial practices it has inspired. As we walk the cyclical human story, we will be covering all time periods, from prehistory, my specialty, to the turn of the last century, as well as geographic regions, all to emphasize that no matter where or when we are from, we are all part of one ever-turning wheel of life. From our crowning achievements to our simple pleasures and everything in between, I sincerely hope that the stories within these pages will allow you to feel more in touch with those who walked this earth before us, and, perhaps, even yourself. Without further ado, my friends, welcome to the Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful. So I think you can probably see why I decided to come to the final resting place of the great transcendentalists in order to begin reading this book. Because even though I don't openly talk about it all that much, it is a philosophy that I weave a lot into most of my work. Anyone who's been around my channel for really any length of time is probably very aware that one of the main things that I talk about here is how humanity has always been pretty much the same. How we are part of something that is a lot larger and more sacred than we give it credit for. How humans that lived tens of thousands of years ago were really not all that much different than we are today. It's easy to think of ourselves as greater than nature, or some sort of colossal force that is above all of it. And in the world we've built, I really can't blame us for thinking that way. But one of the things I really wanted to emphasize in this book is how that is not the case. How, as I said in that introduction, we are part of one ever-turning wheel. So I suppose that brings us perfectly along to where every single one of us started our individual stories. The early years. Also, at some point, I'd really like to do a full audiobook of this where I read the whole thing. I've had some people reach out to me who are visually impaired and are really interested in the book, and so in the effort to make this knowledge accessible to everyone, I'd really like to do an audio version of this. So I don't know when that'll be out, but know that it's something that I have in my mind and is something that I'll be working on. Anyway, Chapter 1, The Early Years. Everyone's childhood is different, but the threads of curiosity and development are the same for all. From searching the crumbling wood of a rotten log for pill bugs to delightfully smearing ketchup on the walls because you can, children have always been curious about the world and learning how it works through trial and error. So, as you reminisce about that favorite childhood story, remember that you are the most recent chapter in a ceaseless human tradition of childhood wonder and discovery. The White Sands Prince. Look at that illustration. Is that not beautiful? I gotta say, to everyone at the Quarto team, you guys absolutely nailed the illustrations in this book. They are beautiful. They are so much more than I could have hoped. The White Sands Prince. A small, rounded stone sat half buried in a powdery bed of white gypsum dust. While most would have strolled past this tiny lithic without a second glance, the boys who ambled up the shoreline had an eye for anything that could be thrown, swung, or otherwise set into abrupt motion. Sure enough, the youngest of the two ran ahead, whooping with excitement, to retrieve this tiny piece of entertainment potential from the mucky lakeshore. He turned to face the expanse of water in front of him and, carefully cradling the rock between his index finger and thumb, twisted his torso slowly back before unleashing the entirety of his 6-year-old manpower. The rock whizzed out of his hand and glanced off the mirrored surface of the water. It bounced again and again, then again once more before it caught an edge and disappeared with a splash. The boy watched the water with his dark eyes as the ripples spread before he let out a disgruntled huff and trotted up the dune towards his chaperone. The youngster scrambled on all fours past the tufts of yucca and the cheerful yellow blossoms of green thread stalks. At the top of the dune, he stopped abruptly next to his brother, who gazed down into the lush valley and let out a low sigh of awe. Below, a group of enormous beasts shambled their way to the swollen lakeshore through the ripples of a shifting sea of grass. Their coats were shaggy and dark, and wet gypsum from the valley floor had splashed and dried around their legs. Each slow and lumbering step required correction to ensure that the beast remained pointed in the right direction, as its enormous feet slid on the slick substrate. The boys stood upright and gazed in wonder at the procession below. Both knew that these lumbering creatures posed no threat to them as long as they kept their distance. The youngest of the two looked down at the herd and jumped up and down, waving his hands in the air and hooting with excitement. Several juvenile sloths that had been playing on the outskirts, much like this youngster, started to shamble their way back to the protective flanks of their herd. One of the largest of the beasts turned its head slowly to gaze at the two tiny bipedal figures who stood high on the grassy ridge. It uttered a low, bellowing moo and returned to its duty of keeping up the rear. This is the first narrative piece in this book. In an effort to humanize our ancient ancestors, I incorporated some of these historical recreations throughout the book. Little first-person narratives that will tell the story that may have occurred behind an archaeological site. They were pretty enjoyable to write. Many are obviously from the perspective of humans. There's one in here that's from the perspective of a pigeon. That was pretty interesting to try and put my mind in. Anyway, we will press on. When did people first set foot in North America? Despite the perceived simplicity of this question, it is one of the most contested topics in archaeology. When pressed, many might suggest that this peopling, as it's referred to, occurred around 15,000 years ago. This date is derived from evidence of Clovis culture scattered across the continent, from the lush forests of what is now known as the Pacific Northwest to the shimmering grasslands of the Great Plains. But on September 23, 2021, a paper entitled Evidence of Humans in North America During the Last Glacial Maximum was published, discussing a pivotal discovery. Several sets of human footprints were discovered pressed into the ancient substrate in the vast plain of the Tularosa Basin in what is now the White Sands National Park in New Mexico, United States. These prints were perceived as having been of immense antiquity due to the layer in which they were found. To obtain the information needed to accurately date the prints, archaeologists and scientists had to rely on a proxy. In this case, that proxy came in the form of a handful of grass seeds.
That now be that.
Fucking hate airplanes. In this case, that proxy came in the form of a handful of grass seeds from the species Rupia serosa, most commonly known as spiral ditchgrass. Since these seeds can be found pressed into the footprints in the white sands, it could be inferred through the law of superposition that they were likely deposited around the same time. This meant that by dating the seeds, one could also learn the date of the footprints. The seeds were dated to around 23,000 years before present, nearly 10,000 years before Clovis culture would leave its mark on the face of this glacier-dominated continent. Needless to say, this discovery rocked the world of archaeology, proving that humans had a presence in North America nearly 10,000 years before the previous oldest evidence suggested. The ancient bank of Lake Otero within the White Sands Desert has yielded tracks of several different individuals over a several thousand-year time span. Of these, many seem to belong to children and young adults, suggesting that teenagers may have been tasked with making treks and hunting due to perhaps their higher energy and enthusiasm. There are also the tracks of a woman accompanied by a smaller set of tracks, presumably those of her child, that trace their way along the bank. This oasis in the prairie would have been a hub of activity for the enormous beasts that roamed the continent in the last glacial maximum. Prints along the bank showed that nearly 20,000 years ago, someone tried their luck at stalking a lumbering ground sloth, suggesting by the human footprints found alongside, and at times inside, the prints of one of these ancient Pleistocene herbivores, though we have no indication of whether this hunt was successful or not. That is the White Sands Prints section, and throughout the White Sands Prints section, you will get a little bit of a taste for one of the other things that I incorporated into this book, which are several sort of sidebars and extrapolations on things that I talk about throughout the text. One of the ways that I write my scripts for my videos is by letting my ADHD completely run wild, and as I'm going, if I find a rabbit hole or tangent, I will just make a little spur, a different document, and write down a whole bunch of information about that. And then I'll try and find ways to incorporate it into the video. I think telling a deep history is really important because it's all too easy to approach it from the surface. So, for example, in the White Sands Print section, I included a piece about Clovis culture. Clovis culture is the name given to what is currently the oldest recognized material culture in North America. This name has been applied to a series of lithic artifacts known as Clovis points, which gained their name from the initial discovery near Clovis, New Mexico. The points themselves consist of around 10,000 examples of biface spear points bearing a characteristic flute that would have allowed them to be attached to a wooden handle. In situ examples of Clovis points have shown that they were used extensively by the paleo-indigenous populations of North America for hunting Pleistocene megafauna such as bison and the infamous mastodon. Examples of these unique artifacts can be found across the United States, as well as some as far south as Mexico and as far north as Alaska. Amazingly, it is theorized that this culture and tradition rose and spread over a span of only 500 years, suggesting a high level of interconnectivity between the paleo-indigenous communities of Turtle Island, the term given by indigenous peoples to the landmass now known as North America. The age of these points, however, is hotly contested, with conservative estimates pointing at around 11,000 years before present, and more liberal estimates placing them around 15,000 or even 25,000 years in some places. That's an example of one of the longer sections. The long sections contain a greater explanation and normally one of the first-person narratives. So why don't we move on to a short section? This one is simply called Hopscotch. A large portion of my time writing this book was spent in my local library, which served as a workspace free of distractions. Every day on my walk home, I would pass a distinctive landmark left on the sidewalk by some of the neighborhood kids. A series of 10 numbered squares that are part of a game that many of us know as hopscotch. While most days I strode past this grid without a second thought, there were several occasions when I impulsively flamingo hopped from one end of it to the other to break up the monotony of my walk home. Little did I know that this game has its roots in antiquity. As the story goes, the game of hopscotch can trace its roots to the Roman Empire some 2,000 years ago. Part of the core of Rome's military might was their training practices, which ensured their armies were coordinated, fit, and equipped. Part of this rigorous training regime was a nearly 100-foot-long track that involved navigating one's footsteps between a long line of squares, all well encumbered with the standard pack and equipment that each soldier had to carry. This exercise enhanced the soldiers' ability to be nimble on their feet and is akin to the exercise done by modern athletes who improve coordination, such as jumping rope or doing a tire run. With such a massive percentage of its population in the army, it wasn't long before this exercise escaped from the Roman training camps and onto the bustling streets where it was picked up by children. Quickly, the game was simplified, becoming a shorter track that was more conducive to a game rather than a workout. A scoring system was added by numbering the squares on the ground, and before long the commandeered military drill had blossomed into a children's street game. By the 1600s, written records began to crop up referring to the game of Scotch hop, which was, for all intents and purposes, the exact same thing as modern-day hopscotch. The game continues to be popular amongst children on sidewalks around the world. On your next walk, should you pass one of these distinctive courses, think of how many hops this game has inspired within the last 2,000 years, and if you're feeling particularly enthusiastic, spare 10 hops to add to this ancient story. The hopscotch section also has a sidebar called Hopscotch Around the World. Like many other forms of entertainment, such as Mancala, see page 96, it will come as no surprise to you that there are numerous variations of hopscotch, found in many parts of the world from India to Brazil. I'm not one to hypothesize on the dispersal of this game, or claim whether or not some parts of the world developed it independently, but instead I can tell you just some of the many versions. In Iran, there is Lele, in Germany it is known as Himmel und Hölle, in Ghana it's Tamatu, and in Scotland it is called Peevers. Each game has slight variations that make it unique from the rest, but all are part of the hopscotch family that has kept children entertained for centuries. Now, I think that the last section from Chapter 1 that I want to read is the other longer narrative section, mostly because I'm really proud of it, and because I know that probably all of you love the story of Onfim. So here we are, in the section aptly titled Onfim. Sweat dripped from his forehead and stung his eyes. His helmet was hot and stuffy, and the sticky stench of decay and rot hung in the air around him. The landscape beyond him was a scorched, lifeless wasteland, from which tendrils of smoke emitted from the still smoldering rubble. The town that once stood here, a small farming village on the outskirts of the kingdom, was unrecognizable from its former idyllic glory. The stone walls wove like black snakes through fields of ash, broken up by the shattered remains of homes whose burnt beams reached towards the sky like the teeth of an ancient beast. It was not the first time he had come this way. Years ago, he had fought a great battle in these very fields, and he remembered it well, when armies of faceless enemies threw themselves upon him and his comrades like waves crashing on the rocks. He had broken them effortlessly. With each swing of his sword and stride of his horse, he worked to drive the forces of evil and tyranny away from the lands that he loved. But this battle was different. There were no armies marching at his side, no pounding of war drums, and no soldiers' songs. The ends of those stories lay littered across the countryside as crumpled masses of fused metal and charred bone. Today, he was the only one, and when he set out from the kingdom's gate, he knew that this was the way that it must be. Finally, after days of following the tale of destruction on the back of his trusty steed, he laid eyes on what had caused the decimation of the land that he loved so much. On the ridge, he eased his stallion to a stop and gazed into the valley below. Along the riverbank plodded a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It walked on 4 legs that stood like the trunks of the strongest trees, with massive feet that could rotate in any direction. Its body was long and thin, and continued into a tail that writhed and coiled like a snake. At the top of its towering neck was a head capped with 2 pointy, almost feline ears, and a mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth. It was from this mouth that the destruction had been wrought, for the wild beast could breathe fire. He let out a quiet sigh. This was it, the grand finale. He stroked the silky black mane of his companion, and slowly, he lifted his helmet from his head and let it fall into the mud below. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath as the cool breeze ruffled his hair. His eyes opened, he drew his sword, and, blade held high, thundered into the valley below. Around 1260, in the medieval city of Novgorod, lived a boy named Onfim. It is believed that he was around 6 or 7 years old. The anaerobic mud outside of the city, throughout archaeological excavation, yielded 12 of Onfim's beresti, singular beresta, works which exude personality. Made of a single thinly cut sheet of birch bark, beresta acts in almost the same way as wood pulp paper. The difference is that it does not require manufacturing, and is therefore less expensive, as it literally grows on trees. The people of Novgorod produced countless documents over the course of the city's 1,000-plus years of existence. Many of Onfim's papers are homework, showing that he was in the process of learning how to read and write in the old Slavonic dialect of Novgorodian. But like anyone at the age of 6 who has been told to sit and write for long periods of time, Onfim grew bored. One document bears the first 11 letters of the alphabet in the Slavic dialect of Old Novgorodian. After this point, the schoolboy grew tired of this task and resorted to drawing himself on horseback, spearing a downed enemy. It's a majestic drawing that takes up more of the page than the original assignment, in true school-aged boy fashion. He even went so far as to ensure we knew who the hero was, proudly labeling the mounted rider as Onfim, a fantasy projection of guts and glory that transcends time. These are not his only battle scenes either, as 2 more of his ancient birch bark sheets depict 3 mounted riders charging into battle, and a rider being chased by 2 men riding a shockingly long 6-legged horse. Adorably, the mismatched numbers of fingers on his character's hands have led some to believe that while he was working on his writing, he was still struggling with arithmetic. An apparent socialite, Onfim even included his friends and family in his masterpiece. One piece depicts a giant fire-breathing creature bearing the label, "I am the wild beast." The inspiration for my story above is signed with the greetings from Onfim to Danilo. Whether the original intent had been to create a gift, it seems like Onfim decided the person who would benefit the most from his wild beast was his friend Danilo. His work also includes depictions of family, most adorably a tiny Onfim standing next to his identical yet larger father, a timeless reminder for the inspiration of many young heroes. The next chapter is Chapter 2, Eat, Drink, and Be Merry. But unfortunately, this is one that you are going to have to read for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. The Encyclopedia of the Weird and Wonderful should be available by the time this video comes out, assuming it comes out after October 8th. Pre-orders and all that can be made on Amazon, but I would also highly encourage you to wait until the book has officially released, because it will then be for sale in your brick-and-mortar retailers. And at the end here, folks, I just want to thank each and every one of you. The last few months have been a huge whirlwind working on projects that I haven't even released yet, but I have some really big stuff coming down the pipeline, and for the first time, I feel like I am really about to make my mark in the YouTube world, as if I haven't done it already. And so I'm just very excited to be able to share with you all what I've been working on, and am very grateful to finally be able to say that I'm about to have a real studio. A place where I can actually do all of the creative things that I love to do and dedicate my time fully and wholly to this channel. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. Remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and most importantly, the next time I see you will be in Phase 3. So savor this while it lasts, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm just getting started.